Before anything else unfolds, please comment where you are watching from and subscribe for more stories like this. Because what follows is not about politics or performance, but about truth spoken without fear. The story begins with Daniel Mercer, an international policy analyst invited unexpectedly to a global forum where speeches were usually predictable and safe. Daniel was not Filipino, nor was he famous. He had spent years researching migration, labor, and overlooked societies, and one country kept appearing in his work in ways that defied stereotypes. When his name was announced for a 10-minute slot, few paid attention. Delegates prepared for routine commentary. Daniel stepped forward without notes, without slides, and without dramatic gestures. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally, about a country often reduced to headlines and cliches. What began as polite listening slowly transformed into something else. No one realized that these 10 minutes would dismantle assumptions held for decades and quietly alter how the world spoke about the Philippines afterward. Daniel did not begin with praise. He began with discomfort. He spoke about how the Philippines was often mentioned only in moments of crisis, rarely in moments of contribution. He listed the roles Filipinos played globally without recognition, from hospitals to ships, from classrooms to construction sites. He spoke of a country exporting resilience while importing judgment. The room grew attentive, not because the words were loud, but because they were precise. Many listeners recognized patterns they had never questioned. Daniel spoke of how Filipinos were praised individually, but overlooked collectively. Applauded as workers, yet dismissed as a nation. He asked why intelligence was acknowledged abroad but doubted at home. No one interrupted. No one checked their phones. The speech was not accusatory, but it was unsettling. By the third minute, the atmosphere had changed. People were no longer waiting for the conclusion. They were leaning forward, sensing that something rarely said aloud was being spoken clearly. Daniel shifted from labor to language, explaining how Filipino fluency across cultures was often mistaken for inferiority rather than adaptability. He spoke about accents mocked without understanding the complexity behind multilingual survival. He challenged the idea that confidence had only one sound. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly. He described how Filipino hospitality was labeled softness, when in reality it was strategic social intelligence shaped by history. He referenced centuries of negotiation, adaptation, and resilience without using dates or names. The message was universal. Strength was not always confrontational. Power was not always loud. By the fifth minute, scribbling notebooks replaced folded arms. Delegates from countries accustomed to lecturing others now found themselves listening instead. Daniel never raised his voice. He never demanded agreement. He simply connected patterns people recognized but had never assembled. The Philippines, he argued, was not underestimated by accident. It was underestimated because it refused to perform strength the way the world expected. As the speech continued, Daniel addressed education, dismantling the myth that excellence only emerged from certain regions. He spoke about Filipino professionals outperforming expectations once given opportunity, then returning home to face doubt. He described a nation that exported competence but imported self-doubt imposed from outside narratives. The room felt quieter, heavier. Delegates began exchanging glances. This was not a patriotic defense. It was an audit of perception. Daniel explained how global systems benefited from Filipino discipline while denying Filipino leadership. He questioned why reliability was rewarded with dependency rather than trust. The Philippines, he said, had become indispensable yet invisible. The contradiction lingered. By the seventh minute, several delegates had stopped taking notes entirely. They were listening differently now, not for arguments, but for accountability. The speech had shifted from information to reflection. People were no longer evaluating Daniel. They were evaluating themselves and the assumptions they had carried into the room without realizing it. Daniel then addressed history without reciting it. He spoke about inherited narratives and how colonial frameworks lingered long after flags changed. He did not assign blame. He described consequences. He explained how Filipinos learned to succeed quietly in systems not designed for them. How humility became survival. How excellence became expectation rather than exception. The phrase stunned the room. Excellence as expectation. Not celebrated. Required. He spoke about how Filipinos rarely demanded recognition, and how that silence was mistaken for lack of ambition. The irony settled slowly. By the 8th minute, the room felt different. The speech was no longer about the Philippines alone. It was about how the world decided whose success deserved spotlight. Daniel paused briefly, not for effect, but for breath. No one moved. When he continued, it felt less like a speech and more like a mirror held steadily in front of everyone present, refusing to be lower. Daniel's final minutes focused on consequence. He asked what the world lost by underestimating the Philippines. He spoke of leadership gaps, innovation delayed, and trust misplaced. He challenged the audience to imagine a future where Filipino voices were heard earlier, not after crises. He ended without applause cues, without slogans. He simply said that dignity did not require permission, and respect should not be conditional. Then he stepped back. For several seconds, the room remained silent. No one clapped immediately. Not because they disagreed, but because they were recalibrating. When applause came, it was uneven at first, then sustained. People stood without signaling each other. Daniel did not smile. He nodded once and returned to his seat. The 10 minutes were over, but the effect was only beginning. What stunned the world was not the delivery, but the realization that what had just been said was obvious, and yet had never been acknowledged so clearly before. Within hours, clips of the speech circulated globally. Titles varied, but reactions were consistent. Viewers described discomfort, clarity, and recognition. Filipinos watching felt something unfamiliar. Not pride alone, but validation without exaggeration. Comment sections filled with quiet agreement rather than arguments. Educators shared the video. Employers forwarded it internally. Students replayed specific lines. Daniel declined interviews, stating that the message was not his to own. That refusal amplified interest. Analysts dissected why the speech resonated so deeply. The conclusion was simple. It did not ask for sympathy. It demanded recalibration. Governments referenced it in closed discussions. Media outlets debated whether it was praise or critique. It was neither. It was exposure. The Philippines was no longer framed as potential. It was framed as present. The shift was subtle but irreversible. The 10-minute speech had not changed policy overnight, but it had changed tone, and tone often shaped what followed next. In Manila, university classrooms discussed the speech without assigning it. Professors noticed students speaking with more certainty. Not arrogance, but clarity. Overseas Filipino workers shared it in group chats, noting how accurately it described experiences they had never articulated. The speech traveled not because it was viral, but because it was useful. Daniel received messages from Filipinos thanking him, which he answered with brief replies. He insisted the credit belonged elsewhere. That insistence mattered. The story did not elevate a savior figure. It elevated a truth. News outlets attempted to reduce the speech to sound bites. Most failed. The power was in its continuity. Each sentence built on the last. By the end of the week, several international panels referenced the speech indirectly. Not quoting it, but responding to it. That response signaled impact. The Philippines had not been defended. It had been reintroduced, and the world was adjusting its posture accordingly. Critics emerged, as they always did. Some argued the speech romanticized resilience. Others claimed it ignored internal challenges. Daniel responded once, stating that acknowledging dignity did not erase complexity. That response quieted much of the noise. Filipinos themselves debated the speech thoughtfully, not defensively. That distinction mattered. The conversation matured quickly. Schools incorporated discussions about perception and narrative. Corporate leaders examined how Filipino talent was positioned internally. International organizations reviewed representation metrics. None of this was mandated. It emerged organically. That organic shift stunned observers more than the speech itself. 10 minutes had not forced change. They had invited it. The Philippines was no longer discussed solely through development metrics. It was discussed through contribution. That reframing did not require agreement. It required awareness. And awareness had arrived quietly, decisively, without announcement. Months later, Daniel returned to research work, largely unnoticed publicly. The speech followed him regardless. It appeared in conference discussions he did not attend. It was translated unofficially into multiple languages. The Philippines continued appearing in global conversations differently. Journalists framed stories with more nuance. Commentators hesitated before defaulting to cliches. These changes were not dramatic, but they accumulated. Filipinos noticed. They spoke differently about themselves. Confidence shifted from defensive to grounded. The 10-minute speech did not create pride. It removed distortion. That removal allowed something already present to stand upright. The world had not been shocked by volume or emotion. It had been stunned by clarity delivered without demand. That distinction explained the endurance of the moment. Long after the applause faded, the recalibration continued, reshaping conversations quietly, one assumption at a time, across borders, institutions, and individual understanding. As the weeks passed, the speech settled into something deeper than a viral moment. It became reference material. Journalists cited it without naming it. Educators framed discussions around its ideas without showing the clip. Filipinos abroad noticed subtle changes in conversations at work. Questions shifted from surprise to curiosity. Instead of being asked why they were competent, they were asked how they approached problems. That difference mattered. In the Philippines, commentators debated why it took a foreign voice to articulate what many had lived for decades. The debate was not bitter. It was reflective. Daniel's words had not claimed authority. They had illuminated patterns. That illumination made denial difficult. Institutions began reviewing leadership pipelines involving Filipino professionals. None of this was announced publicly. It happened quietly, the way real recalibration often did. The speech had not demanded respect. It had exposed its absence. And once exposed, that absence could no longer be comfortably ignored without consequence. Daniel remained largely silent during this phase, refusing invitations to speak further on the topic. His refusal unsettled people more than his participation would have. It reinforced the idea that the message did not belong to him. The Philippines was not being defended. It was being recognized. Filipino students noticed something else. Confidence shifted internally. They spoke with less apology, less need to explain themselves. That shift altered classrooms, workplaces, and online discourse. The speech had not created new facts. It reorganized existing ones. That reorganization revealed contradictions that could not be unseen. Employers reconsidered assumptions about leadership readiness. Media editors re-examined headline language. These adjustments were small individually, but cumulative in effect. The 10-minute speech continued working long after it ended. Not through repetition, but through resonance. It had struck something accurate enough to persist without reinforcement, which explained why attempts to dismiss it failed quickly and quietly. Criticism resurfaced occasionally, often framed as fatigue rather than disagreement. Some argued the moment was overblown. Others claimed nothing truly changed. Yet those closest to the shift disagreed. Filipinos navigating global spaces felt the difference in tone. Subtle but undeniable. Daniel eventually addressed a closed academic forum, clarifying that the speech was never intended as praise. It was intended as correction. Correction of framing. Correction of assumption. That clarification reframed the debate. The Philippines had not been elevated artificially. It had been placed accurately. That accuracy unsettled people accustomed to oversimplification. Correction was harder to dismiss than opinion. As discussions matured, the speech became shorthand for a larger reckoning about how countries were valued beyond economic metrics. The Philippines entered that reckoning not as a case study, but as evidence. Evidence that capability could be systematically overlooked without justification. That realization carried weight far beyond the original forum. In the Philippines, younger audiences engaged the speech differently from older generations. Older Filipinos recognized lived experiences finally articulated. Younger Filipinos recognized permission to reject inherited doubt. That generational alignment created momentum. Schools incorporated discussions about narrative power. Students questioned why external validation had ever been required. These were not loud revolutions. They were quiet recalibrations of identity. Abroad, Filipino professionals reported increased trust in leadership roles. Not universally, but noticeably. The change was uneven, yet real. Daniel observed these developments from a distance, documenting shifts rather than commenting on them. His research gained attention, but he redirected focus towards systemic analysis rather than personal recognition. That choice reinforced credibility. The speech had succeeded precisely because it was not followed by a personal brand campaign. It existed independently. That independence allowed it to mature into something more durable than outrage or praise. It became reference memory, and reference memory shaped behavior. Media retrospectives attempted to identify the exact moment the room shifted during the speech. Analysts debated phrasing, tone, structure. Most missed the simpler explanation. The speech worked because it respected the audience enough not to persuade them emotionally. It invited recognition instead. That invitation proved difficult to refuse. Filipinos watching globally noticed that the speech never asked for sympathy. It asked for accuracy. That distinction mattered deeply. Sympathy faded. Accuracy endured. Daniel later explained privately that he had trusted the audience to connect patterns themselves. That trust changed the dynamic. People felt implicated rather than instructed. That implication fueled reflection. Over time, the speech was referenced less as an event and more as a turning point. Not because everything changed, but because something essential shifted. The Philippines was no longer framed primarily as developing. It was framed as contributing. That reframing altered conversations quietly but persistently, ensuring the 10 minutes continued echoing far beyond their original duration. International forums began featuring Filipino speakers earlier in discussions, not as closing perspectives. That sequencing shift mattered. Placement signaled value. Filipino voices were no longer supplementary. They were integral. This adjustment did not originate from policy. It originated from perception. Daniel's speech had exposed a blind spot rather than creating a rule. Blind spots, once revealed, altered behavior organically. The Philippines appeared in case studies not as recipients, but as problem solvers. That narrative repositioning filtered slowly through institutions. Some resisted. Others adapted. Filipinos noticed which environments changed and which did not. That awareness informed decisions about where to invest effort. The speech had not promised fairness. It had provided clarity. Clarity allowed choice. That empowerment became its most enduring outcome. The 10-minute speech did not give Filipinos something new. It removed something unnecessary. Doubt imposed from repetition. Once removed, confidence reorganized itself naturally, grounded in evidence rather than reaction. Years later, the speech was still referenced, though often indirectly. It became an example of how precision outperformed passion. Filipino educators used it to teach critical listening. Business leaders referenced it when discussing unconscious bias. Students encountered it not as inspiration, but as validation of competence already present. Daniel declined anniversaries and commemorations, insisting the moment belonged to collective awareness rather than individual legacy. That insistence prevented dilution. The speech remained intact, unbranded, uncommodified. Attempts to replicate its impact elsewhere failed because they misunderstood its origin. It did not succeed because it defended the Philippines. It succeeded because it described it accurately. Accuracy disrupted convenience. Convenience had sustained misperception for decades. The 10-minute speech interrupted that cycle. The interruption did not shout. It stated that restraint made it difficult to argue against without confronting one's own assumptions. Over time, that confrontation became unavoidable for those paying attention. The Philippines did not transform overnight. That expectation would have missed the point entirely. Transformation occurred in posture rather than policy, in confidence rather than concession. Filipinos spoke with greater certainty in international spaces, less eager to over-explain. That shift altered interactions subtly. Daniel's speech was no longer cited as exceptional. It became assumed context. That assumption marked success. The best ideas eventually disappeared into normality. Media references decreased, but influence remained. Filipinos recognized the difference between being heard and being listened to. The speech had moved the conversation closer to listening. That movement mattered. It changed the emotional labor required to exist globally. Filipinos no longer had to preemptively justify competence. That release of burden was not dramatic. It was liberating, and liberation rarely announced itself. It settled. The 10-minute speech continued doing its work invisibly, shaping expectations quietly, which proved far more powerful than any sustained publicity campaign ever could. Daniel eventually reflected privately on why the speech resonated so widely. He concluded that it respected complexity without centering conflict. It acknowledged flaws without diminishing dignity. That balance was rare. Filipinos watching recognized themselves accurately rather than idealized. That accuracy fostered trust. Over time, the speech became an internal reference point for Filipinos navigating global spaces. It reminded them that explanation was optional when preparation was evident. That internalization mattered more than external praise. The world had not granted permission. It had adjusted perspective. That adjustment reduced friction. Filipinos noticed fewer micro-questions, fewer conditional compliments. These changes were subtle but cumulative. The speech did not promise fairness. It enabled recalibration. Recalibration changed behavior, and behavior reshaped outcomes. The 10-minute speech had not created momentum artificially. It revealed momentum already present but misinterpreted. Once revealed, it no longer needed amplification. It simply continued, steady and undeniable. As new global crises emerged, the Philippines appeared differently in analysis. Not as an afterthought, not as a footnote. Filipino expertise was sought earlier. That timing shift altered influence. Daniel observed these patterns academically, documenting correlation rather than claiming causation. He remained careful. The speech was a catalyst, not a solution. Solutions required systems. Catalysts required truth. The 10-minute speech provided the latter. That truth unsettled complacency. Some resisted. Others adapted. Filipinos recognized where adaptation occurred and gravitated accordingly. That discernment empowered choice. The speech had not argued for special treatment. It argued for accurate placement. That placement carried responsibility. Filipinos embraced it without fanfare. Over time, the speech became less about the Philippines and more about how narratives shaped opportunity globally. That expansion ensured longevity. The moment transcended origin. It became a reference for how precision could disrupt inherited bias without hostility or spectacle. Years passed, and the speech faded from headlines but not from influence. Filipinos who had watched it early described it later as a quiet turning point. Not because it changed others, but because it changed how they carried themselves. That internal shift proved decisive. Confidence grounded in accuracy replaced defensiveness shaped by repetition. Daniel continued his work, rarely mentioning the speech publicly. He understood that moments endured when they were not overexplained. The Philippines continued navigating global systems with sharper awareness. That awareness informed strategy rather than reaction. The 10-minute speech had not delivered conclusions. It delivered clarity. Clarity demanded response. Filipinos responded by occupying space more deliberately. That occupation altered dynamics. Not through confrontation, but through presence. The world adjusted accordingly. That adjustment, slow and uneven, remained in motion. The speech had not ended. It had embedded itself into how conversations began rather than how they concluded. Observers attempting to measure the speech's impact often asked the wrong question. They asked what changed immediately. The better question was what no longer needed explanation. Filipinos noticed that shift clearly. Certain assumptions no longer required rebuttal. Certain expectations no longer surprised. That absence of friction marked progress. The speech had recalibrated baseline understanding. That recalibration persisted without maintenance. Attempts to reverse it felt forced. Narratives lost credibility when contradicted by lived evidence. Daniel once remarked privately that truth aged well when it was precise. The speech aged well, not because it was emotional, but because it was accurate. Accuracy resisted erosion. The Philippines continued asserting presence without apology. That presence reshaped interactions quietly. The 10-minute speech became less about what was said and more about what followed naturally. What followed was a gradual alignment between perception and reality. That alignment reduced distortion. Reduced distortion enabled trust. Trust altered opportunity. The speech eventually entered academic literature, analyzed for structure rather than sentiment. Scholars noted its restraint, its refusal to dramatize, its reliance on pattern recognition. That analysis reinforced its credibility. Filipino students encountered it as part of coursework, not inspiration. That framing mattered. It normalized recognition. The Philippines was no longer exceptionalized positively or negatively. It was contextualized accurately. That accuracy reduced emotional charge. Over time, the speech became less about Daniel and more about collective reflection. That transition marked maturity. The moment no longer needed a speaker. It had entered shared understanding. Filipinos recognized when spaces had adjusted and when they had not. That recognition guided engagement. The 10-minute speech did not create entitlement. It clarified expectation. Expectation shaped preparation. Preparation shaped outcome. The chain continued quietly, long after the applause ended, reshaping conversations without requiring repetition or defense. In global forums, Filipino participation grew more assertive, less explanatory. That shift changed dynamics. Conversations moved faster. Assumptions were challenged implicitly rather than argued explicitly. Daniel observed this evolution with satisfaction, knowing the speech had served its purpose. It had removed distortion. Removing distortion allowed truth to function normally. That normality felt revolutionary to those accustomed to misrepresentation. The Philippines did not become louder. It became clearer. Clarity traveled further than volume. That realization echoed beyond national context. Other countries referenced the speech when examining their own narratives. The 10-minute speech became a case study in reframing without confrontation. That approach proved influential. It demonstrated that recognition could be earned through precision rather than performance. Filipinos embraced that lesson. It aligned with cultural tendencies toward humility without erasure. The speech validated restraint as strength. That validation altered how Filipinos navigated power globally, choosing presence over persuasion. Eventually, retrospectives labeled the speech understated rather than explosive. That understatement explained its endurance. Explosions faded. Understatements lingered. The Philippines benefited from that lingering recalibration. Daniel continued declining invitations to recreate the moment. He understood that repetition diluted impact. The speech remained singular. Its uniqueness preserved credibility. Filipinos did not ask for similar speeches. They moved forward with recalibrated confidence. That movement mattered more. The 10-minute speech had not provided answers. It had corrected framing. Correct framing allowed better questions. Better questions shaped decisions. Over time, that process became self-sustaining. The world did not need to be reminded. It had adjusted. The Philippines occupied its space differently. That difference manifested in leadership, collaboration, and representation. The speech had done its work by disappearing into normality. That disappearance signaled success. Truth rarely needed constant defense once accurately positioned. New generations encountered the speech without context of controversy. To them, it sounded obvious. That reaction marked progress. What once stunned now felt self-evident. Filipinos welcomed that normalization. It meant the speech had shifted baseline understanding. Daniel's role faded appropriately. The message remained. The Philippines continued asserting presence grounded in contribution rather than apology. That posture reshaped interactions naturally. The 10-minute speech had not created momentum artificially. It had revealed momentum previously misread. Once revealed, that momentum carried itself. The world adjusted gradually, unevenly, but irreversibly. Filipinos recognized where adjustment had occurred and invested accordingly. That discernment shaped future outcomes. The speech's legacy lay not in quotation, but in behavior. Behavior reflected understanding. Understanding reshaped opportunity. That chain continued unfolding without fanfare, which was precisely why it endured. As the speech receded into collective memory, its influence became structural rather than emotional. Filipinos found fewer barriers framed as capability questions. Conversations focused on execution rather than justification. That shift reduced cognitive load. Energy previously spent proving competence redirected toward innovation. Daniel documented these trends academically, careful not to overclaim. The speech was a moment, not a miracle. Yet moments mattered when they corrected trajectory. The Philippines' trajectory adjusted subtly. That adjustment compounded. Over time, its impact became visible through representation patterns and leadership roles. The 10-minute speech had not promised transformation. It had enabled alignment. Alignment reduced friction. Reduced friction accelerated progress. That sequence explained why the moment endured. It respected complexity while insisting on accuracy. Accuracy proved powerful. The world had been stunned not by surprise, but by recognition delayed too long. Once arrived, that recognition refused to retreat quietly back into misperception. Daniel rarely reflected publicly on the speech, but privately acknowledged its timing mattered. The world had been ready to listen. That readiness amplified impact. Filipinos sensed that readiness and stepped forward accordingly. The speech had opened a door already unlocked. Someone simply turned the handle. That image resonated. It suggested opportunity was not newly granted. It had been waiting. The Philippines stepped through with composure rather than urgency. That composure shaped perception. Confidence without demand proved compelling. Over time, the speech became less about national pride and more about narrative integrity. Integrity endured. It resisted distortion. Filipinos carried that integrity forward. The 10-minute speech continued echoing not as sound, but as orientation. Orientation guided movement. Movement reshaped space. Space accommodated presence. The chain remained intact, quietly shaping future interactions without reliance on spectacle or repeated validation. The story of the speech concluded without closure because closure implied finality. There was none. The Philippines continued evolving. Global systems continued adjusting. The speech remained a reference rather than a relic. Filipinos did not seek to preserve it. They absorbed it. That absorption mattered. It meant the message had integrated. Daniel's role diminished appropriately. The truth he articulated belonged to those living it. The 10-minute speech had not centered itself. It centered understanding. Understanding redistributed confidence. Confidence reshaped engagement. Engagement altered outcome. That progression continued. The world had been stunned once. It did not need repetition. The recalibration was complete enough to persist independently. The speech existed now as context rather than content. That transition marked its success. It had moved from moment to mindset, which ensured longevity without dependence on memory or celebratio. Ultimately, the 10-minute speech stunned the world because it spoke plainly where silence had persisted too long. It did not exaggerate. It did not accuse. It corrected. That correction dismantled inherited distortion quietly and effectively. The Philippines was not elevated artificially. It was positioned accurately. That accuracy altered conversation, confidence, and opportunity. Daniel stepped away. Filipinos stepped forward. The world adjusted. Not dramatically. Appropriately. The moment endured because it respected intelligence rather than manipulating emotion. It trusted recognition to do the work. Recognition arrived. Once arrived, it stayed. The speech did not demand applause. It demanded honesty. Honesty proved sufficient. What followed was not shock sustained by spectacle, but understanding sustained by truth. The 10 minutes ended. Their effect did not. It continued shaping perception wherever the Philippines was discussed, not as a subject of assumption, but as a participant whose presence no longer required explanation.